Please don't tell my mother I'm single, she whispered, but he stayed anyway. In the afternoon, the automatic doors of Orlando Memorial Hospital slid open. The late afternoon sun spilled across the entrance as nurses wheeled patients toward waiting families. Margaret Griffin stepped outside, carrying a small bouquet of yellow daisies given to her by one of the oncology nurses. She had finally been discharged. 6 months of chemotherapy, countless appointments, more sleepless nights than anyone should have to endure. And now, she was going home. A cheerful nurse adjusted Margaret's blanket and smiled at Xenia. So, she looked around the parking lot. Your daughter's boyfriend couldn't make it? Margaret's smile faded almost imperceptibly. It's all right, she said softly. I'm sure he has work. Xenia felt her stomach twist. She hated that smile. It was the smile her mother wore whenever she pretended disappointment didn't hurt. Without thinking, Xenia blurted out, "He's just parking the car." The words escaped before her brain had a chance to stop them. The nurse nodded happily. Oh, wonderful. Margaret's eyes brightened immediately. He made it? Xenia forced a smile. Of course. Inside, panic exploded. What have I just done? At that exact moment, a tall man carrying a cardboard box walked past the hospital entrance. He looked to be in his mid-30s, dressed in jeans and a navy polo shirt with the logo of an engineering company embroidered on the chest. He was clearly in a hurry. Margaret looked straight at him. Her face lit up. Oh, she smiled warmly. You must be Frank. The man stopped walking. I'm sorry? Before he could say another word, Xenia hurried over, grabbed the sleeve of his shirt, and pulled him a few steps away. Her voice dropped to an urgent whisper. Please. She looked as though she might cry at any second. Please don't tell my mother I'm single. Frank blinked. What? I know this sounds insane. It absolutely does. I only need 10 minutes. 10? Just until she gets home. He stared at her in complete disbelief. I don't even know your name. I'm Xenia. Great. I'm Frank. I know. Apparently. For the first time, Frank glanced toward Margaret. She was watching them with the hopeful smile of a mother who had spent months worrying whether she would ever see her daughter happy again. Something inside him hesitated. He had every reason to walk away. Instead, he sighed. A small, defeated smile appeared on his face. He walked over and extended his hand. It's nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Griffin. Margaret beamed. Oh, I've waited so long to meet you. Frank had planned on helping his coworker move furniture that afternoon. Instead, without the slightest warning, he had just become someone's imaginary boyfriend. He told himself it would only last 10 minutes. He had no idea. Those 10 minutes were about to change the course of his life. Frank insisted on carrying Margaret's overnight bag to the car. It wasn't heavy, but Margaret thanked him as though he had lifted something much bigger. A gentleman, she whispered to Xenia. I already like him. Xenia nearly tripped over the curb. Frank caught her elbow before she lost her balance. Careful. She smiled awkwardly. I usually don't lie to strangers. I feel much better knowing today is special. Despite himself, Frank chuckled. The drive to Margaret's small house in a quiet Orlando neighborhood should have taken 20 minutes. It took nearly 40, mostly because Margaret talked the entire way. So, Frank, how did you two meet? Xenia answered immediately. At a bookstore. Frank spoke at exactly the same time. At a coffee shop. Silence. Margaret looked from one to the other. A bookstore, with coffee, she guessed hopefully. Xenia laughed far too loudly. Exactly, Frank nodded. That's exactly what I meant. Margaret smiled. I knew there had to be an explanation. Frank glanced sideways at Xenia. She mouthed, sorry. He mouthed back, bookstore? She shrugged helplessly. When they arrived, Frank helped carry groceries inside. The house was small but warm. Family photos covered nearly every wall. A younger Margaret stood beside a smiling man with kind eyes. Little Xenia appeared in dozens of pictures, missing front teeth, oversized Halloween costumes, school plays, birthday cakes. Frank couldn't help smiling. You were an adorable kid. I had terrible hair. You still have the same smile. The compliment escaped before he realized he had said it. Xenia blinked. So do you. They both looked away at the same time. Margaret insisted they sit in the living room. I'll make lemonade. Xenia immediately stood. Mom, You're supposed to rest. Nonsense, Frank gently interrupted. I'll help. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You cook? He does, Xenia answered automatically. Frank looked at her. I do? She whispered through clenched teeth. You do now. 5 minutes later, Frank somehow found himself making fresh lemonade while Xenia searched every kitchen cabinet for sugar. You've lived here your whole life. I know where everything normally is. And today, my brain is on vacation. He laughed. I've noticed. While they worked, Margaret watched from the dining table with unmistakable satisfaction. You know, she said, the kitchen feels happier today. Xenia froze for a second. Frank quietly continued slicing lemons. Neither of them knew how to answer. Dinner conversation became an obstacle course. Margaret asked where Frank grew up. Tampa, he answered. Xenia confidently added, he loves the beach. I actually prefer mountains. She kicked his shoe beneath the table. Ow. Margaret frowned. What happened? Frank smiled. I think your daughter just declared war. I did not. You absolutely did. Margaret laughed so hard she nearly spilled her soup. I haven't laughed like this in weeks. The room fell quiet. That single sentence changed everything. For a moment, pretending didn't feel like pretending anymore. It felt like giving someone a peaceful evening she desperately deserved. Frank had expected dessert to be a quick slice of pie. Instead, nearly an hour later, he was still sitting at the Griffin family dining table with an empty coffee mug in front of him. The promised 10 minutes had quietly stretched into an entire evening, and strangely, no one seemed eager for it to end. Margaret disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying a homemade apple pie that was slightly lopsided. I baked it before treatment started, she admitted with a laugh. It's been waiting in the freezer for a special occasion. Xenia nearly choked on her water. Mom, you didn't have to. Margaret smiled knowingly. I think I did. Frank accepted a slice. I've never been honored by frozen pie before. It improves with age, Margaret replied. So do I. The three of them laughed. For the first time all evening, the laughter didn't feel awkward. It felt natural. After dessert, Margaret stood and walked toward the old wooden cabinet beside the fireplace. Wait here. She returned carrying a thick photo album with faded blue fabric covering the front. Oh no, Xenia muttered. Not the album. Oh yes. Margaret settled comfortably onto the couch. If Frank is part of this family, he deserves evidence. There is absolutely no evidence, Xenia protested. There is an entire album of evidence. Frank grinned. I'm suddenly very interested. The first photograph showed 6-year-old Xenia wearing a princess costume nearly twice her size. The plastic crown had slipped over one eye. She looked furious. Margaret laughed. She cried because the neighbor's little boy refused to be the dragon. Frank couldn't stop smiling. So what happened? She chased him around the yard with a toy sword. I won. You terrified him. I inspired him. You made him move away. I call that commitment. Frank burst into laughter. I definitely believe that story. Another picture appeared. 8-year-old Xenia sat in the middle of a school stage holding a violin. Frank studied the image. You play violin? Xenia groaned. No, you don't. I played exactly one song. Margaret corrected her. Half of one. What happened? The bow slipped. I sneezed. You hit the principal. It was an accident. Frank laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. I wish I'd seen that. You and everyone else in Orlando. Photo after photo revealed a different version of Xenia. Missing teeth, paint-covered overalls, an unfortunate homemade haircut. Halloween dressed as a pumpkin because she'd refused to wear anything too scary. Frank looked at every single picture, not because he had to, because he genuinely wanted to. You smiled exactly the same way, he said quietly. What? When you were 6, when you were 16, and today. She looked down at the album, suddenly feeling oddly shy. I guess some things don't change. No, they don't. Margaret closed the album with a satisfied sigh. I've embarrassed my daughter enough. For one evening, Xenia added. For one evening, Margaret agreed. As they carried the empty plates into the kitchen, Frank automatically rolled up his sleeves. I'll wash. Xenia stared at him. You don't have to. I know. I want to. She handed him a dish towel. I should warn you. I'm not very useful in kitchens. I noticed. I can make cereal. Impressive. I once burned instant oatmeal. He stopped washing dishes and looked at her. How? I honestly don't know. He laughed again. I'm almost afraid to ask. A few minutes later, Margaret quietly walked into the kitchen. She stopped in the doorway. Frank was washing dishes with practiced ease. Xenia was attempting to dry them. Attempting. Every few seconds another spoon slipped onto the counter. Frank caught a falling glass before it hit the floor. Nice save, she said. I've had practice. Margaret folded her arms. I knew it. They both looked over. Knew what? Xenia asked. Frank cooks. Frank smiled. A little. Margaret pointed at her daughter. You never learned. I survived. Barely. Frank couldn't resist. To be fair, she makes excellent reservations. Xenia pointed the dish towel at him. I liked you 10 minutes ago. You still like me. Don't push it. Margaret laughed so hard she had to lean against the counter. You two argue like you've known each other for years. The words lingered in the room. Frank and Xenia exchanged a quick glance. Neither of them answered, because somehow it already felt true. Later that evening, they sat together on the back porch. Fireflies floated above the small garden. The Florida air was warm, peaceful. So, Frank said, we should probably decide how we supposedly met. She nodded. Definitely. Bookstore? She made a face. Too risky. Coffee shop? Too ordinary. What if people ask which one? He sighed. We're terrible criminals. The worst. They both laughed. Then, without even realizing it, they started filling in the blanks. Favorite movie. Favorite pizza. How long they'd supposedly been dating. Who had said I love you first. Every answer came faster than the last. Soon they weren't pausing anymore. The lies stopped sounding rehearsed. They sounded lived in. At one point, Frank frowned thoughtfully. Wait, your birthday is in September, right? She blinked. I never told you that. You mentioned school starting when we were driving. You remembered? He shrugged. I listen. For reasons she couldn't explain. That simple sentence stayed with her. When the clock struck 9, Frank finally stood. I really should go. This time, Xenia didn't stop him. She simply walked him toward the front door. Thank you. You've thanked me at least 12 times. I counted. I know. She smiled. I still mean it. Before Frank could answer, Margaret called from the hallway. Frank. He turned. The older woman was holding a small velvet pouch. She walked over slowly and placed it in his hands. He looked confused. Mrs. Griffin. She smiled gently. It belonged to my husband. Frank carefully opened the pouch. Inside rested an old silver pocket watch, worn smooth by decades of careful hands. His eyes widened. I can't accept this. I'm not giving it away. She closed his fingers around it. Just keep it for me tonight. He looked puzzled. Why? Margaret's smile turned soft. My husband used to carry it whenever someone important came into our lives. She glanced affectionately at Frank. It brings me comfort knowing it's with someone kind. Frank looked speechless. Xenia stared at her mother. She knew exactly what that pocket watch meant. Margaret had never, not once, trusted it to anyone outside the family. Frank swallowed hard. I promise. I'll take very good care of it. As Margaret smiled, neither Frank nor Xenia realized that the old pocket watch wasn't simply a keepsake. It was the first time Margaret had quietly begun treating a complete stranger, like someone who might one day belong. Frank left the Griffin house just after 9:30. The old silver pocket watch rested safely in the front pocket of his jeans. Every few minutes, he instinctively touched it to make sure it was still there. It felt heavier than it should. Not because of the metal, because of the trust that came with it. As he drove away, he smiled to himself. Tomorrow morning, I'll return the watch. Wish them well, and everyone can go back to their normal lives. It sounded simple enough. Life, however, had other plans. The following morning, dark clouds rolled across Orlando. By 10 o'clock, rain hammered rooftops throughout the neighborhood. Frank had just parked outside the Griffin house when he noticed water pouring from the edge of the roof. At first he thought it was normal. Then he saw Xenia standing on a small aluminum ladder with a bright yellow raincoat that was clearly too big for her. She was holding a roll of duct tape. Frank stared. Please tell me you're not planning what I think you're planning. Xenia looked down. Oh, hi, what are you doing? Roof maintenance. With duct tape? It's temporary. It's going to become permanently worse. She sighed dramatically. I watched 3 YouTube videos. That's exactly what worries me. Before Frank could stop her, Xenia stretched a little farther. The ladder wobbled. Oh, she lost her balance. Frank rushed forward and caught the ladder just before it tipped. You know, he said calmly, I've only known you for about 18 hours, and I've already saved you from gravity twice. She climbed down sheepishly. I appreciate your commitment. I appreciate staying alive. Frank looked up at the roof. There's probably a loose flashing. You know roof repairs? I renovated my own house after my divorce. The last 2 words slipped out before he could stop them. Xenia noticed, but she didn't ask. Instead, she simply handed him the ladder. So, professional? He smiled. Professional enough to stop you from using duct tape. An hour later, Frank was standing on the roof replacing damaged shingles while rain slowed to a gentle drizzle. Xenia stood below. Need anything? Yeah. What? Please stop trying to help. I'm helping emotionally. You just handed me a garden rake. I panicked. He laughed. I've noticed. Mrs. Hernandez from next door stepped outside carrying groceries. She looked up at Frank, then at Xenia, then smiled knowingly. Well, it's about time somebody fixed this roof. Xenia blinked. Oh, it's not, Mrs. Hernandez interrupted. I've been telling your mother for years this house needs a good man around. Frank nearly dropped his hammer. Xenia turned bright red. We're just, Mrs. Hernandez winked. I know exactly what you two are. She walked away before either of them could answer. Frank looked down. That went well. It could have been worse. How? She could have invited everyone from church. He laughed. Please don't give Fate ideas. Unfortunately, Fate already had one. By lunchtime, 3 different neighbors had waved at Frank. One elderly man shouted, Congratulations, son. Another asked, So when's the wedding? A teenager riding a bicycle yelled, Mr. Griffin. Frank looked completely confused. I've had 5 different last names this morning. Xenia buried her face in her hands. Welcome to my neighborhood. After repairing the roof, Frank noticed the front flower beds had become overgrown. We should trim these. You own scissors, don't you? I own enthusiasm. That's somehow more dangerous. An hour later, Frank carefully planted new flowers while Xenia enthusiastically watered everything, including the garden hose, her own shoes, Frank, and the mailbox. Oops, you sprayed me. I was aiming for the roses. The roses are behind you. I know that now. Determined to redeem herself, Xenia picked up a bag of fertilizer. Unfortunately, she grabbed grass seed instead. Half an hour later, Frank looked across the yard. Why is the sidewalk green? She followed his gaze. I don't want to answer that. You planted grass. On concrete. I was optimistic. He laughed so hard he had to sit down on the porch steps. Not a polite laugh. Not the careful laugh he'd given the night before. A real one. The kind that made breathing difficult. Xenia looked at him, then started laughing too. Soon neither of them could stop. Margaret watched quietly through the kitchen window. She hadn't seen her daughter laugh like that in years. Later that afternoon, the 3 of them sat on the porch drinking iced tea. The repaired roof gleamed under the returning sunshine. It looks wonderful, Margaret said. Frank shrugged. It wasn't much. It was. She smiled warmly. You keep saying things aren't much, but somehow, they always become something important. Frank looked away, unexpectedly touched. As evening approached, Margaret went inside to prepare sandwiches. Frank remained outside helping Xenia coil the garden hose. You didn't have to spend your whole day here, she said quietly. I know. So why did you? He thought for a moment. I guess, I didn't want your mom worrying about another repair. She smiled softly. You're a good man. I've made plenty of mistakes. So has everyone. He looked toward the garden. There was a time I thought I had everything figured out. What happened? He hesitated, then answered honestly. I got married. And then, I got divorced 3 years later. It wasn't dramatic. No cheating. No huge fight. We just slowly became strangers living in the same house. He smiled sadly. I haven't dated much since. I figured maybe I wasn't very good at loving someone. He didn't realize Margaret had quietly stepped onto the porch carrying the tray. She heard every word. Frank immediately stood. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for you to. Margaret gently placed the tray on the table. Then she walked over and rested a hand on his shoulder. Her voice was soft. Frank. He looked at her. She smiled with the quiet wisdom of someone who had loved for decades. You still know how to love. He frowned slightly. What makes you think that? She glanced toward the freshly repaired roof, the flower beds, her laughing daughter, then back at him. Because people who don't know how to love don't spend an entire rainy day fixing someone else's home. Her eyes glistened. You still know how to love. That's enough. Frank felt something tighten in his chest. No one had ever looked at his divorce that way. For the first time in years, he wondered if perhaps the end of one love story didn't mean he had forgotten how to begin another. Over the next 3 weeks, Frank became part of the Griffin family routine, so gradually that no one could remember exactly when it happened. At first, he only came by to return the pocket watch. Then Margaret asked him to stay for coffee. The next day, Xenia needed help carrying groceries. 2 days later, Frank found himself driving both women to Margaret's follow-up appointment because Xenia's car refused to start. After that, he simply kept showing up. On Saturday morning, the three of them went grocery shopping together. Margaret pushed the cart. Frank carried the list. Xenia contributed mostly to confusion. We need tomatoes, Frank said. Xenia placed a jar of tomato sauce into the cart. Those aren't tomatoes. They used to be. That's not how grocery lists work. Margaret tried to hide her laughter. At the produce section, Xenia picked up an avocado and squeezed it. Too hard, Frank said. She picked up another. Too soft. A third. Also too soft. She narrowed her eyes at him. Are you secretly judging fruit for a living? I'm an engineer. That doesn't answer the question. It absolutely does. Near the bakery, an older employee offered them a sample of wedding cake. Xenia accepted immediately. Frank looked suspicious. Why wedding cake? The employee smiled. You two are newlyweds, aren't you? They both froze. Margaret, standing several feet away, became suddenly fascinated by a display of bread. Xenia laughed nervously. Oh no. Frank spoke at the same time. Not yet. Silence. Xenia slowly turned toward him. Not yet? Frank looked horrified by his own answer. I meant, not at all. The employee smiled knowingly. That's what my husband said. She handed them 2 extra samples. For practice. Xenia waited until they were out of earshot. Not yet? I panicked. You're getting worse at lying. No, I'm getting more optimistic. She almost walked into a cereal display. Frank caught her by the shoulders. Again. For one long second, they stood much closer than necessary. Then Margaret called from the next aisle. Do we need more coffee? They stepped apart immediately. Yes, they both answered. Their days continued like that. Small errands, shared meals, unplanned laughter. Frank drove Margaret to every medical appointment. He remembered which parking garage had the shortest walk. He carried crackers in the glove compartment because treatment sometimes made her nauseated. He learned that Xenia talked too much when she was nervous and became completely silent when she was truly afraid. Xenia learned that Frank hated olives, loved old movies, and always checked twice to make sure every door was locked. They knew things about each other that had never been part of their fake relationship. And somehow, neither of them questioned it. One warm evening, they stopped for ice cream near Lake Eola. Margaret ordered butter pecan. Frank chose chocolate. Xenia insisted on a complicated sundae with caramel, strawberries, whipped cream, and rainbow sprinkles. Frank stared at it. That's not ice cream. It's happiness in a cup. It's a medical emergency in a cup. She held out a spoon. You're jealous. I'm afraid. She pushed the spoon toward him anyway. He took one bite, then another. I knew it, she said. You like happiness. Don't tell anyone. Later, they drove toward the western edge of the city and parked where they could see the distant glow of Disney fireworks beyond the trees. Margaret stayed in the car with the windows open. Frank and Xenia sat on the hood beneath the humid Florida sky. Colorful bursts rose in the distance. The sound reached them several seconds later. Xenia hugged her knees. When I was little, Mom used to bring me here because we couldn't afford park tickets. Frank looked toward Margaret. She made it feel special anyway. She was always good at that. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Frank said quietly, "You do that too." "Do what?" "Make ordinary things feel important." Xenia looked at him. The next firework lit his face. She suddenly wanted to ask what they were doing, what any of this meant, but Margaret leaned out the car window. "Are you two kissing yet?" Xenia nearly slid off the hood. "Mom," Frank coughed into his fist. Margaret smiled innocently. "I was only asking." The moment disappeared, but the feeling didn't. A week later, Margaret had another follow-up appointment. The doctor expected it to be routine. Instead, her blood pressure dropped while they waited for test results. One moment she was joking with the nurse. The next, she collapsed. "Mom!" Xenia caught her before she hit the floor. The room erupted into movement. Nurses rushed in. A wheelchair appeared. Someone asked Xenia to step back. She couldn't. Her hands were shaking. "What's happening?" "Her body may be reacting to the medication," a nurse explained. "We need to run tests. Is she going to be okay? We're taking care of her." But those words didn't reach Xenia. All she could see was her mother disappearing through another set of hospital doors, the same doors she had walked out of only weeks earlier. Frank arrived 20 minutes later. Xenia had called him without thinking. She stood alone in the hallway, arms wrapped around herself, trying desperately not to fall apart. The moment Frank saw her, he crossed the room. "She collapsed," Xenia whispered. "They won't tell me anything yet." She was laughing. She was fine, and then she wasn't. Her breath became uneven. Frank didn't offer empty reassurance. He didn't tell her everything would be fine when he didn't know that. He simply reached for her hand. His fingers closed around hers. Xenia looked down at their joined hands. There was no Margaret watching, no neighbor nearby, no one to convince. No reason to pretend. Still, Frank didn't let go, and Xenia held on just as tightly. They sat together outside the examination room until the doctor finally returned. "It was a minor complication," he explained. "She'll need monitoring overnight, but she's stable." Xenia closed her eyes in relief. Frank's thumb moved gently across the back of her hand. Only then did they realize they were still holding on. Neither of them pulled away, because somewhere between the first lie and that frightening hospital hallway, Frank had stopped playing her boyfriend, and Xenia had stopped wishing he were only pretending. Margaret remained in the hospital for only one night. The doctors adjusted her medication and assured them the complication had been minor. By the following afternoon, she was smiling again. "You two look much worse than I feel," she joked as Frank helped her into the car. Xenia folded her arms. "You scared us." Margaret reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I'm sorry." Frank started the engine. "No more surprises, okay?" Margaret smiled. "I'll do my best." The drive home felt unusually quiet. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. For nearly a month, Frank had become part of their lives. Hospital visits, roof repairs, ice cream, grocery shopping, Disney fireworks, lazy Sunday mornings with coffee on the porch. Somewhere along the way, no one had remembered they were pretending anymore, least of all Frank. 2 evenings later, Margaret fell asleep early after dinner. Frank and Xenia sat alone on the back porch, the same place where they had invented their ridiculous love story. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Frank broke the silence. "We have to tell her." Xenia already knew what he meant. "I know. It isn't fair." "No, it isn't." He stared at the backyard. "I don't want her to think we lied because we wanted something. We didn't. I know. But eventually, she deserves the truth." Xenia nodded slowly. "I'll tell her tomorrow." Frank looked at her. "Together?" She smiled faintly. "Together." The next afternoon, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair by the living room window, knitting something that looked suspiciously like a scarf, even though it was 85 degrees outside. Frank cleared his throat. "Mrs. Griffin." Margaret looked up. So serious. Xenia sat beside her mother. "There's something we need to tell you." Margaret quietly put down the knitting needles. She looked from one face to the other. "I've been wondering how long this conversation would take." Frank exchanged a puzzled glance with Xenia. He took a deep breath. "When we met, we weren't dating." Margaret nodded. "I know." Xenia blinked. "No, I mean, We literally met outside the hospital. I know. Frank frowned. The coffee shop wasn't real. I know. The bookstore wasn't either. I know. We've never celebrated an anniversary. I know. Xenia stared at her mother. You? No? Margaret couldn't hold it anymore. She burst into laughter. Not a polite chuckle. A full, joyful laugh that filled the room. The same laugh she had rediscovered over the past few weeks. Frank looked completely bewildered. Were we really that obvious? Margaret wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. My dear, a fake couple never looks at each other the way you two do. Silence. Xenia slowly turned toward Frank. He looked back at her. Neither of them knew exactly what Margaret meant, until they realized they had been smiling at each other without noticing. Again. Margaret leaned back comfortably. Do you remember the first day? Frank nodded. The hospital. You shook my hand. I did. You smiled politely. I was terrified. I could tell. She laughed softly. But when Xenia looked at you, she wasn't looking at a stranger. Xenia frowned. I was panicking. You were hoping. Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. You looked at him like someone who wanted to believe life could still surprise her. She turned toward Frank. And you kept looking at her whenever she wasn't paying attention. Frank opened his mouth to protest. Then stopped. Because she was right. I almost told you both that first evening, Margaret continued. But then something happened. What? Xenia asked. You laughed. You both forgot I was in the room. You were arguing over lemonade. And for the first time in years, my house sounded alive. Her voice became quieter. I wasn't going to interrupt that. Frank lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. For lying. Margaret reached across and patted his knee. I've lived 61 years. I've raised a daughter. I've been married. I've survived cancer. She smiled warmly. I know the difference between a lie and a beginning. Xenia looked at her mother in disbelief. So, you weren't fooled, Margaret grinned. I helped. Frank looked up. You helped. She nodded proudly. Quite a lot, actually. She counted on her fingers. Who do you think kept inviting you to dinner? Frank blinked. You? Who kept asking you to drive me to appointments even when your schedule was busy? You? Who pretended the roof looked terrible after you'd already fixed it? Frank laughed. That was you? It looked perfectly fine. I know. I wanted another excuse. Xenia covered her face. Mom. Margaret wasn't finished. And who kept saying things like, stay for dessert, stay for coffee, stay for breakfast? She smiled mischievously. I may have overdone breakfast. Frank couldn't stop laughing. So the whole neighborhood, Margaret interrupted. Oh, that wasn't me. The neighbors managed that all by themselves. The laughter slowly faded. Margaret's expression softened. She looked at her daughter. You know what I noticed? Xenia shook her head. You started singing again while doing dishes. Xenia froze. She hadn't even realized it. Margaret turned to Frank. And you laughed with your whole face. The first time you came here, you smiled because you were being polite. Now, you smile before you even knock on the door. Frank felt an unexpected lump rise in his throat. Margaret gently reached out and took both of their hands, placing them together exactly as she had seen them outside the hospital days earlier. I kept asking Frank to stay, not because I believed the story. She looked lovingly at Xenia. I asked him to stay because I haven't seen my daughter this happy in years. Tears filled Xenia's eyes. Margaret squeezed their hands one last time. If this relationship had only been pretend, it would have ended the day you told me the truth. She smiled knowingly. But somehow, you're both still here. Neither Frank nor Xenia answered. They couldn't, because for the first time since that afternoon outside Orlando Memorial Hospital, there was no lie left between them. Only one truth neither of them had found the courage to say aloud. 3 months later, Margaret's hair had begun to grow back, soft and silver, and slightly uneven because she insisted on trimming it herself. Her doctors were pleased with her recovery. She had more energy, a stronger appetite, and a growing habit of giving unsolicited relationship advice to anyone within hearing distance. Xenia returned to teaching full-time. Frank still came for dinner twice a week, sometimes 3 times. No one called it pretending anymore. But strangely, neither Frank nor Xenia had officially called it anything else. They had come close, many times. A quiet moment on the porch, a hand held too long, a goodbye that felt unfinished. Yet every time the words reached the edge of becoming real, one of them stepped back, perhaps because they were afraid, perhaps because what they already had felt too precious to risk. Then Frank received the call from Seattle. His company had offered him a senior position overseeing a major theme park engineering project. It was the kind of opportunity he had spent years working toward. A promotion, a larger team, a new beginning. He accepted. No one asked him not to. On his final evening in Orlando, Margaret prepared dinner. Xenia barely touched hers. Frank talked about practical things, the apartment he had rented, the weather in Seattle, how he would probably need a real winter coat. Margaret listened quietly. She understood that people sometimes discussed small things when the large ones hurt too much. After dinner, Frank reached into his jacket pocket. He placed the old silver pocket watch on the table. "I should return this." Margaret looked at it, then shook her head. "No," Frank frowned. "Mrs. Griffin, this belongs to your husband." "It did, and you trusted me to keep it for one night." One night became several months. She pushed it gently back toward him. "Keep it." "I can't." "You can." Her eyes moved from Frank to Xenia. "Now, it belongs to someone in the family." The room fell completely silent. Frank stared at the watch. Xenia looked down, blinking back tears. Margaret stood. "I suddenly need to check the garden." "At night?" Xenia asked. "The flowers are unpredictable." She walked away, leaving them alone. Frank picked up the watch. "I don't know what to say." Xenia tried to smile. "You're usually good at making things up." He laughed softly. "So are you." Neither moved. Finally, Frank stepped closer. "Take care of her." "I will. And take care of yourself." "I'll try." "That answer worries me." "You worry too much. Only about important things." Their eyes met. For 1 second, Xenia thought he might kiss her. Frank thought about it too. But neither of them crossed the distance. Instead, he hugged her, slowly, carefully, as though both understood that letting go would be harder than holding on. The next morning, Frank drove to Orlando International Airport alone. He had told them goodbye the night before because he didn't want another painful scene. At least, that was what he told himself. He checked his luggage, passed through the entrance, then heard someone shouting his name. "Frank!" He turned. Xenia was running toward him through the terminal, one hand gripping a small lunchbox. She nearly collided with a luggage cart before reaching him. "You could have called," he said. "You could have said goodbye properly." "I thought I did. You didn't." She held out the lunchbox. "What's this?" "Food. I can see that. You always forget to eat when you travel." Frank looked at the box, then at her. She had packed sandwiches, fruit, and the cookies Margaret made when she wanted to disguise emotional interference as baking. He smiled. "You ran through an airport to bring me lunch?" "I didn't run. You're out of breath." "I walked urgently." He laughed. Then his expression softened. 10 minutes. He glanced at the lunchbox, then at the woman standing in front of him. 10 minutes is a very long time. Xenia smiled through tears. "It really is." Frank pulled her into his arms. No kiss. No promise they could not yet understand. Only a long embrace in the middle of a crowded airport. When he finally stepped back, he said, "I'll call." "You'd better." "But this time," he smiled, "not because I'm pretending." Then he picked up his bag and walked toward security. Xenia watched until he disappeared from view. 6 months later, Margaret was officially declared in remission. Xenia was still teaching. Frank was still in Seattle. They video called almost every evening, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes neither had much to say. They simply stayed on the screen while Xenia graded papers and Frank worked through engineering plans. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One afternoon, Xenia left school carrying a stack of student drawings. As she stepped through the front gate, she stopped. Frank stood on the sidewalk. An old suitcase rested beside him. The silver pocket watch hung from his hand. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Xenia smiled. "You're back in Orlando for work?" Frank shook his head. "No." He took one step closer. "This time, I came because of you." Xenia opened her mouth, but no words came. Frank didn't ask for an answer. He simply smiled, and she smiled back. From across the street, The world continued moving. Cars passed. Children laughed. Palm trees shifted beneath the warm Orlando breeze. There was no proposal, no wedding, no perfect ending tied neatly with a ribbon. Only two people standing together at last, with no frightened mother to impress, no story to maintain, and no reason left to pretend. Sometimes, the most important people in our lives don't arrive with grand declarations. You discover that the person who changed your life wasn't the one who promised forever, but the one who kept coming back until forever felt possible. They simply stay. What began as a 10-minute favor became months of laughter, quiet kindness, shared meals, and a love that neither of them expected to find. Because real love rarely starts with perfect timing. It grows through ordinary moments, honest hearts, and people who choose to show up again and again. So here's a question for you. Do you believe the strongest relationships begin with love at first sight, or with two strangers slowly becoming home for each other? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to read your story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that sometimes the best relationships begin with the smallest acts of kindness. Until next time, thank you for letting us be part of your story.